I'm Claire Hallstead. I'm 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived in the shadow of a man who believed silence was stronger than love. My father, Captain Robert Matthews, built his life on medals and command. I built mine on trying not to vanish under his gaze. In our home, discipline was louder than laughter. My sister was polished into his golden air, praised for every small victory, shielded from every failure. Me? I was the one told to know my place. Even when I succeeded, his silence said more than any insult. I was never enough. The day I opened my Naval Academy acceptance letter, my heart nearly burst. I thought I had finally earned his recognition. But instead of pride, he slid law school applications across the table, as if my dream was nothing more than a childish distraction. That was the moment his silence stopped being background noise and became my enemy. Ever been told you don't belong in the very life you fought for? Hit like if someone ever dismissed your dream as a joke. Comment if you've ever had to prove yourself twice as hard just to be seen once. It all began years earlier, in a living room that felt more like a shrine to him than a home when I reached for a medal behind glass, and his boots thundered down the hallway. Every morning in Virginia began the same way. The metallic scrape of his belt buckle, the hiss of starch on pressed uniforms, the echo of authority moving from the kitchen to the hallway. My father was never late, and his discipline poured into every creak of the floorboards. I was 10, old enough to understand what silence meant in our home. Silence meant he was displeased. Silence meant I had failed. That morning in 2005, I woke early, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was defiance already sprouting inside me, though I wouldn't have used that word yet. The living room was a shrine to him. Framed photographs of parades lined the walls. Robert Matthews in uniform, chest out, chin lifted. Shadow boxes displayed rows of ribbons, medals, and a saber polished so clean it threw sunlight back into your eyes. He was a captain then, every piece of brass and silver reflecting his authority. I padded across the carpet in bare feet, small and unnoticed, or so I thought. My gaze fell on the medal case, the Purple Heart glinting behind the glass. I reached out, fingers trembling, to trace the outline of the honor I'd only heard whispered about at family gatherings. The sharp thunder of boots behind me froze my breath. "Don't touch that." His voice sliced sharper than any blade. I jerked my hand back as if the glass itself had burned me. His figure loomed in the hallway, shoulders squared, cap tucked under his arm. The morning light did not soften him. "The uniform is for men, Claire," he said, voice flat, final. "Not for little girls who play dress-up." The words hit harder than if he'd struck me. I swallowed, my throat dry, unable to answer. Behind him, my mother, Evelyn, appeared in her robe. Her presence was softer, like the morning sun breaking through storm clouds. She crossed the room quietly, kneeling beside me, shielding me from his stare. Her hands were warm when they wrapped around mine. "You're stronger than you know, my Storm," she whispered, using the pet name only she gave me. Her tone carried the tenderness my father seemed to have buried under decades of service. But her words could not erase his. He had already turned away, the echo of his boots filling the hall again, each step a reminder that in his eyes, I was already a disappointment. I sat still, clutching the edge of my mother's robe, the weight of his dismissal pressing on my chest. I didn't fully understand rank or tradition, not yet. But I understood rejection. I understood that my father saw me as less. When the front door shut behind him, silence fell again. Not peaceful silence, heavy, suffocating silence, thick with all the things he would never say. My mother stroked my hair, murmuring promises that someday he would see me differently. But I had already decided I wouldn't wait for someday. Alone in that living room shrine, surrounded by proof of his victories, I whispered words he would never hear. "One day, you'll see me in uniform." The whisper wasn't a plea. It was a vow. The envelope trembled in my hand, but his silence was louder than any storm. It was spring, 2013, a quiet afternoon in our Virginia kitchen. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, dappling the table with restless shadows. The air smelled faintly of lemons. Evelyn's endless attempt to keep the space bright, despite the heaviness that often sat in our home. I was 17, old enough to know what battles I was walking into, but still young enough to hope for some flicker of approval. The envelope had arrived that morning, heavy with possibility, stamped with the crest of the United States Naval Academy. My hands shook when I tore it open, though the words inside blurred almost instantly because my heart was racing ahead of them. "Congratulations." I barely read the rest. I already knew I had been chosen. I carried the letter into the kitchen where my father sat, sleeves rolled, posture rigid as if the table itself were a war room. Evelyn was at the sink, drying plates slowly, eyes darting between us like she already feared the outcome. "Dad," I said, sliding the envelope toward him. My voice cracked. I got in. For a moment he looked at it, his jaw tightened, a twitch just below his eye, the only betrayal of surprise. He didn't touch the paper. Instead, he reached for a folder at his side and pushed it across the table toward me. The label, neatly printed, read, "Law School Applications." "You'll need these," he said flatly. I stared at the folder as if it were some cruel joke. "I don't, Dad. I don't want to be a lawyer." My hands curled into fists. "I want to serve. I want the Navy." His eyes cut through me, cold and exact. "You're not going to waste your life chasing fantasies. The law will give you stability, respect." "The uniform?" He shook his head, exhaling like the word itself was poison. "The uniform isn't for you." It was the same echo from years ago, only sharper now, because this time I had proof in my hands, an institution saying yes, even as he said no. I felt Evelyn step closer, the faint brush of her hand against my shoulder. Her voice was quiet, almost conspiratorial. Storms aren't meant to stay grounded. Her words were lifelines, soft but strong enough to tether me to my own conviction. But Robert didn't answer. He didn't argue. He didn't rage or slam his fist on the table. He simply turned his head away and picked up the newspaper, the rustle of its pages louder than any shout. It was his silence that cut deepest. The absence of recognition, the withdrawal of any fatherly warmth. In that moment, I felt the thread between us snap, fragile as it had always been. I left the folder of law applications on the table, untouched. I took the acceptance letter back, its weight far heavier now, and walked down the hall to my room. I half expected him to call after me, to at least command me not to do it, but the silence followed me like a shadow. That night, after Evelyn had gone to bed, I sat at my desk, pen in hand. The Academy's commitment form lay before me, crisp, expectant. My fingers hovered only a second before I signed. Every stroke of ink was a defiance, a declaration. I sealed the envelope, pressed the stamp firmly in the corner, and walked it down the driveway to the mailbox. The air outside was cool, the night sky scattered with stars. I slipped the letter into the slot, listening as it slid into darkness. It felt less like sending a form and more like firing the first shot in a private war. When I returned inside, the kitchen light still burned. The folder of law school applications sat untouched on the table, exactly where he had left it, a monument to a path he had carved in his mind for me. I glanced at the hallway where he had retreated hours earlier and whispered to no one but myself, "This is my choice, my war. You'll see me in that uniform." His silence had exiled me, but my letter had anchored me, and though I didn't know it yet, that anchor would hold through every storm to come. The uniform clung to me like a second skin, yet every eye waited for me to fail. Annapolis in the summer was brutal. The humidity wrapped around us like chains, and the sun beat down until sweat soaked through every crease of the stiff navy whites. I was a plebe, bottom of the ladder, nameless until proven otherwise. Every morning began with shouted orders, boots slamming on asphalt, and the suffocating weight of expectation pressing against my shoulders harder than any rucksack. But the heaviest burden was invisible. It was the gaze. The half-second sneers, the whispers behind clipped salutes, the smirks when they thought I wasn't looking. "She won't last a month," one muttered as we lined up for inspection. "Just here to make a statement," another scoffed. Their words weren't new. They were echoes of my father's voice. Echoes that stung sharper because they came from people I was supposed to stand beside as equals. Inspections were the worst. Drill instructors would run gloved fingers over our belts, our collars, searching for any flaw. My boots, though polished to mirrors, were never quite shiny enough. My bed corners never quite sharp enough. My salute never crisp enough. The others failed too, of course, but when my mistakes surfaced, the whispers doubled. It was as if every misstep I made proved a point already etched into their minds, that Claire Hallstead was destined to crack. One afternoon, after hours of drill under the blistering sun, the cadet next to me, a lanky boy from the Midwest, wavered. His face had gone pale, lips dry and cracked. I saw the moment his knees buckled, the slow collapse beginning. Instinct pushed me faster than thought. I lunged, catching his arm before he hit the ground, bracing his weight against my shoulder. "Sir, cadet down!" I shouted. my voice cutting through the chants of cadence. The drill instructor snapped his head around, eyes narrowing as he jogged toward us. For a heartbeat, I braced for the usual criticism, some cruel twist that would make even this look like a failure. But instead, he crouched beside us, checked the cadet's pulse, and barked at the others to bring water. Then he looked at me. For the first time since I arrived, his gaze wasn't measuring me against doubt. It was recognition. "Hallstead," he said, voice firm but almost approving, "you just saved his life." The words struck deeper than any insult ever had. They weren't effusive, but they were real. They were proof that I was more than what they whispered. I felt heat rush to my face, though whether it was pride or exhaustion I couldn't tell. Around me, the other cadets were silent. No one dared sneer, not in that moment. Respect, fleeting and fragile, hung in the air like a truce. But truce is not peace. By evening, the whispers returned, softer now but still present. Lucky break. She just wanted attention. Recognition was temporary. The prejudice was permanent. And yet, I clung to those words, "You just saved his life," like a lifeline. That night, after lights out, I made my way quietly to the mailroom. My uniform was damp with sweat, my body aching in every muscle, but some part of me still hoped. I opened the small metal door of my mailbox, heart pounding with the same anticipation I'd carried since day one. Empty. No letter, no words from Robert. Not even a short line scrawled on plain paper. His silence weighed heavier than the uniform on my shoulders, heavier than the eyes that doubted me all day. At least my peers mocked me aloud. My father's absence was worse than erasure, a void that screamed louder than any insult. I closed the mailbox softly, pressing my forehead against the cool metal for a moment before straightening. Outside, the night air was thick with salt from the Chesapeake, and I whispered to the dark, the same vow I'd carried since childhood. "You'll see me in this uniform, and when you do, it won't be because you believed in me, it'll be because I refuse to vanish." The silence answered, but I walked back to my barracks steadier than before. Bullets tore through steel, but I refused a stretcher I had work to finish. The Somali coast in 2017 was an oven. The sun beat down like a second assault, the air so thick with heat it scorched every breath. Our patrol boat shuddered under a hail of gunfire, the metallic shrieks of ricochets ringing louder than any order shouted above the chaos. My body moved on instinct, every lesson drilled at Annapolis, and every sleepless night of training converging into a single truth: survive and keep your people alive. "Lieutenant Hallstead, port side hit!" someone yelled. I turned, and my stomach clenched. A sailor had gone down, his leg mangled by shrapnel. Blood pooled dark and fast beneath him, spilling into the grooves of the deck. He screamed once, raw and animal, before shock began to drag him under. I dropped low, pressing against the blistering deck as bullets snapped overhead. Crawling felt endless, my palms slipping in streaks of blood, but quitting wasn't a language my body understood. Every inch forward was another defiance against fear. When I reached him, I ripped my belt free, looping it tight above the wound, yanking until he gasped. His eyes rolled, but I leaned close, shouting over the gunfire, "Stay with me! You're not leaving this deck today." The world erupted again, an explosion against the hull. Shrapnel tore into my side, hot and sharp, burning like liquid fire under my ribs. For a second, my vision blurred. Hands reached for me. "Ma'am, stretcher!" But I shoved them away. "No," I barked, voice harsher than I'd ever heard it. "Get him out first. I'm still moving." The pain was a living thing clawing at me, but adrenaline is its own anesthetic. I kept pressure on the sailor's wound, guiding the others as we dragged him toward cover. My own blood soaked through my uniform, sticky and hot, but I gritted my teeth. Every breath stabbed, every heartbeat echoed with the question, how long until I collapse? But collapse wasn't an option, not while he was still breathing. By the time we reached relative safety, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the bandages. But his pulse steadied. His eyes fluttered open long enough to meet mine, and in that fragile second, something passed between us: gratitude, disbelief, maybe even hope. The medics whisked him away, and I finally let myself slump against the bulkhead. My side burned, wet and warm, but I stayed conscious, jaw locked. I refused the stretcher again, refusing the weakness it implied. That night, as the crew patched the battered ship, word began to spread. "Iceback," someone muttered, half in awe. I asked once what it meant, and they laughed. "Because you don't melt, ma'am. You're frozen solid under fire." The nickname stuck. At first it felt alien, a title too sharp for the girl who once stood shaking with an Academy acceptance letter in her kitchen. But then I realized it wasn't about me. It was about survival, about proving that worth is measured in blood, sweat, and refusal. If the cost of respect was being carved into something cold, then so be it. Weeks later, when the sailor I'd saved was discharged, I received a card. A simple Christmas card, the kind you'd find in any drugstore. Inside, in messy handwriting, he'd written, "You saved me. My kids still have a father because of you. Every year since, one arrived without fail. I never answered, but I kept every single one." Yet respect is a fragile thing in the military, especially for women. Whispers don't die, they mutate. Even as iceback became a badge of survival, rumors slithered in the shadows. Maybe they lowered the bar for her. Maybe it was luck. The kind of doubts that travel faster than truth. Lying awake at night, my side aching, I traced the scar with trembling fingers. It wasn't medals or nicknames that mattered. It was the silence of those who still refused to believe. That silence, more than bullets or blood, was my enemy. And though I didn't know it yet, that same silence would follow me years later dressed in whispers, sharpened by the one man who had taught me its sting first. He didn't fall in love with my medals, he loved the pieces I thought no one could carry. By 2022, I wore the rank of captain on my shoulders. But in the Pentagon, stripes and stars were often drowned beneath a tide of paperwork, politics, and polished rhetoric. My voice had weight in combat zones, but in conference rooms lined with suits and secure laptops, the air was different, cold, skeptical, thick, with quiet judgments. That morning, I was presenting a risk assessment report on naval logistics in the Red Sea. I'd spent weeks assembling it, casualty projections, supply vulnerabilities, contingency routes. Every word was chosen with care. And then, across the polished oak table, came a voice that sliced through my slides like a scalpel. "Your numbers are solid," James Whitaker said, "but the framing undercuts your conclusion. You're burying the lead." A ripple went through the room. He wasn't military, just a civilian analyst, a contractor in a dark suit with rolled-up sleeves that hinted at impatience. His tone wasn't disrespectful, but it was unflinching. I felt my jaw tighten. I'd fought for years to be heard, and now here was some desk-bound analyst poking holes in what had taken me months to refine. The briefing ended with polite nods, but my spine was rigid the whole time. When the room emptied, I packed my laptop with clipped efficiency, refusing to look at him. The next morning, I found a revised draft of my own report waiting in my inbox. My breath caught as I scanned it. He hadn't rewritten my analysis, he'd lifted it into a clearer frame, reorganizing without losing a single piece of substance. And attached to the email, just 3 words, "You were right." That evening, he appeared by my office door with 2 coffees in hand, the steam curling into the fluorescent air. "Truce?" he asked. I should have brushed him off. Instead, I found myself walking beside him into a late-night diner off Independence Avenue, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in decades. We sat across from each other, the coffee cooling between us. At first, we talked shop. Logistics, threats, the absurdity of bureaucrats who thought war was just numbers on a page. But then the conversation shifted. "You carry yourself like someone who doesn't want to be carried," James said suddenly. I blinked. "What does that mean?" He leaned forward, his eyes steady. "Most people fall in love with the medals, the stories, the victories. They love pieces of you, the parts that shine. But I think it's the fractures, the things you hide, that matter more. And I don't scare easy." The words settled over me like a weight and a balm at once. For a long time, silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the clatter of dishes behind the counter. Finally, I exhaled. "My father hasn't spoken to me in years," I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken it aloud to someone who wasn't my mother. The confession tasted bitter, like old wounds reopened. James didn't flinch. He didn't offer pity or hollow reassurances. He just nodded, his expression steady, and said, "Then let me stand beside you when he won't." It was such a simple sentence, but it unraveled something inside me. The years of silence, the weight of proving myself to a man who refused to see it all, loosened, just slightly, under those words. When we left the diner, the night air was sharp with the scent of rain on asphalt. James walked me back to the Pentagon parking lot, our steps in rhythm, quiet but certain. I knew then that whatever storms lay ahead, whether in combat, in politics, or in the shadows of my father's disdain, I had found an anchor. Promotion should have felt like victory, yet the applause sounded like doubt. The sun blazed high over Naval Base Coronado, gilding the edges of the parade ground. I stood stiff in my uniform, the new silver eagle of captain pinned to my collar. Cameras clicked, flags stirred, and the voices around me rose in practiced cheer. My mother's smile glistened from the front row, her hands clasped together as if she could hold the moment still. Somewhere behind her, James's steady gaze anchored me. But under the applause there was another sound, quieter, sharper, cutting through like static, a whisper, then another. Not cheers, but mutters, curling at the edges of pride. She got here because the standard slipped. Politics. That's all. The words were barely audible, but I felt them like phantom shrapnel, wounds blooming under the surface. After the ceremony, there were congratulations, handshakes, stiff smiles. A few junior officers spoke with genuine warmth, but the senior ones kept their eyes cool, their compliments formal, as if acknowledging the rank but withholding belief. Pride soured in my throat. That night, back in my office, I found the memo, printed on plain paper, slipped under my door, anonymous. My hands froze on the page. Captain Hallstead's reforms have coincided with a troubling decline in operational standards. Favoritism and lowered bars undermine the readiness of our force. Are we trading tradition for politics? No name, no signature, just accusations dressed as analysis. It was already making its rounds. I knew it before I finished reading. Whispers travel faster than orders. I clenched my jaw, shoving the memo into the drawer, but its weight didn't lessen. For every sailor who believed in me, another would see this and wonder. My father's voice echoed, though he hadn't spoken to me in years. The uniform is for men. The bar was lowered for you. The following week, during training inspections, I overheard it. Two subordinates, voices low but not low enough. Convenient, isn't it? Captain Hallstead proves the numbers look good, but who lowered the bar? Laughter. A mutter of agreement. They didn't see me. I walked past, my stride even, my expression unreadable. But inside, something hollowed. I returned to my quarters that evening, sat at my desk, and let the silence settle. My medals hung neatly on the wall, polished and precise, but they looked like accusations instead of achievements. The truth gnawed at me. This wasn't the Navy testing me. This was personal. Someone was feeding the whispers, curating the doubt. And though I didn't have proof, I could almost feel the hand behind it. My father had never needed to raise his voice to undermine me. Silence had always been his sharpest weapon. Perhaps now, distance had only sharpened it further. The phone rang, breaking the stillness. For a second, I braced for more shadow, another rumor, another blow. Instead, it was the chapel coordinator, her voice brisk but warm. Captain Hallstead, your request has been approved. The Naval Chapel is available for your wedding date. I froze, the words colliding with the silence like thunder. My chest tightened, not with dread this time, but something dangerously close to hope. James and I had spoken of it in fragments, stolen conversations between duty and deployments. Now it was real, marked on a calendar, sanctified by tradition, a promise of joy in the middle of the storm. But even as I hung up, staring at the phone, I felt the two realities colliding, the whispers gnawing at my rank, and the promise of standing before him as a bride. Victory and doubt, love and betrayal, braided so tightly I couldn't separate them. The applause still rang in my ears, faint and hollow, and beneath it, whispers sharper than bullets. Some knives don't glint in light, they hide in casual words over a drink. The officers' bar at Coronado hummed with low laughter, glass against glass, and the hum of stories retold until truth bent into legend. I wasn't a stranger there, but I never quite belonged either. Rank can elevate you on paper, but in a room like this, it only sharpens the lines between inclusion and isolation. James sat beside me at the bar, his tie loosened, his smile disarming in its ease. He fit anywhere without effort. I envied that. For me, belonging always felt conditional, something earned over and over again. At the far end, two junior officers raised their glasses in a half-drunken salute. Funny, one said, his voice pitched just high enough to carry. Funny how standards change when a Hallstead walks in. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the din. My fingers tightened around my glass. I told myself not to react. Not here, not in a room where every twitch could be read as weakness. I focused on the condensation sliding down the glass, willing the heat in my chest to subside. Ignore it, Claire. Let it dissolve like so many other slights. But James didn't ignore it. He stood, slow and deliberate, the scrape of his chair cutting a line through the noise. Conversation faltered as he walked across the room, his steps unhurried but heavy with intent. He stopped at their table, set his own glass down with a click. "You want to toast something?" His voice was calm, almost conversational. "Toast the sailor she dragged out of gunfire off the Somali coast. Toast the one who sends her a Christmas card every year because he's alive to write it. Or maybe toast the shrapnel still lodged in her side, since you're so eager to measure standards." Silence spread, brittle and suffocating. The smirk slid from the junior officer's face, replaced with a tight flush. He muttered something that didn't quite form into words, his glass hovering uncertainly in his hand. James didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His words lingered in the air longer than any reprimand, wrapping the room in a silence no one wanted to break. Then he turned, walked back, and sat down beside me, as if he hadn't just stripped the air bare. The chatter resumed slowly, fragmented, cautious. But no one looked at me now. They looked away, their laughter forced, their drinks suddenly fascinating. I kept my face steady, but my throat ached with unshed words. When the noise finally swallowed us again, James leaned closer, his voice low enough for only me. "You don't need me to defend you," he said, "but I will when others are blind." For a heartbeat, I couldn't answer. My chest tightened, not with the sting of insult anymore, but with something sharper, almost unbearable. Gratitude. The kind that feels like it might undo you if you let it. I took a sip of my drink instead, letting the cool bitterness ground me. The bar's neon light flickered against the glass, painting everything in fractured blue. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced down. The message glowed across the screen, stark and cold. "Don't embarrass the family. No name, no signature, none needed." The words hollowed me more effectively than any insult at the bar. My father's silence had always been a wall, but tonight it broke into intrusion. He hadn't spoken to me in nearly a decade, and yet here he was still pulling strings, still branding me with shame across the distance. The glass in my hand trembled slightly. James noticed but said nothing. His hand brushed against mine under the bar, steady, grounding. The laughter around us swelled again, but I only heard the echo of his message. "Don't embarrass the family," as though my existence itself were humiliation. The knife had cut deeper this time, and it hadn't glinted at all. I sealed the envelope with steady hands, though my heart already knew his answer. The paper crackled under my fingertips, the embossed navy blue crest of the Naval Chapel gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Everything about the invitation was flawless. The print, the weight of the cardstock, even the gold trim around our names. Everything except the name written on the front, Robert Matthews. My father's name sat on that envelope like a verdict waiting to be delivered. The apartment was hushed that evening, Washington, D.C., glowing outside our window in scattered lights and the faint hum of traffic. James sat across from me at the small dining table, sleeves rolled, fingers curled loosely around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He'd been watching me for nearly an hour, saying nothing while I addressed the envelope, crossed out mistakes, wrote again. Finally, he broke the silence. "You don't owe him that chance, Claire." His voice was steady, gentle but firm. It wasn't a warning, it was a plea. He had seen me bleed, literally and otherwise. He had seen the scars of silence my father carved deeper than any battlefield. He didn't want to see me invite more. I kept my eyes on the ink, the black strokes sharp against white. "This isn't hope," I whispered. "It's closure." James leaned back, studying me. His silence wasn't Robert's silence. It wasn't condemnation. It was weight, careful and protective, the way he often measured words before letting them go. I folded the invitation carefully, slid it into the envelope. My hand hesitated only once before pressing the flap closed. That sound paper sealing against adhesive felt final, irreversible. My chest tightened, but I kept my movements steady. "He won't come," James said after a moment. "I know," I replied. "Then why?" I met his gaze across the table, the lamplight catching the sharp planes of his face, the tired compassion in his eyes. "Because if I don't send this, he wins twice. He gets to reject me, and he gets to know I was too afraid to ask again." The words surprised me as I said them, but they were true. Every silence from him had been a weapon, every absence a strike. This envelope was my answer, not begging for his presence, but refusing to let his absence define me. James nodded slowly, as though he understood, even if he hated it. His hand reached across the table, palm warm against the back of mine. "Then let it be the last time you bend toward him." I squeezed his hand once before pulling away. There was no room for hesitation tonight. The mailbox stood 3 blocks away, its blue metal chipped by years of weather, its slot waiting like a mouth that only ever swallowed and never returned. The night air was cool, spring rain still clinging to the sidewalks. I carried the envelope tucked close, my pulse louder than my footsteps. Each step felt like walking through layers of memory, his boots echoing through hallways, the silence after I handed him my academy acceptance letter, the emptiness of mailboxes at Annapolis. Every rejection led here, to this one final gesture. When I reached the mailbox, I held the envelope for a long moment. The city moved around me, distant sirens, laughter spilling from a bar on the corner, the rhythm of traffic lights. None of it touched me. "This isn't hope," I said again to the night, to myself. "It's closure." The envelope slipped from my fingers into the dark slot. The sound it made, soft, final, echoed louder in my chest than I expected. It felt like dropping a weight I'd carried too long, though the ache in my hands said the weight wasn't gone yet. I stood there, staring at the mailbox as though it might spit the envelope back out. But of course, it didn't. The city kept moving, the night kept breathing. And somewhere, eventually, my father would open it, or maybe he wouldn't. Either way, it no longer belonged to me. Weeks passed. Each day I checked the mail. Bills, wedding RSVPs, junk flyers, even a letter from the Academy Alumni Board. But nothing with his handwriting. No phone call, no acknowledgement. His silence was louder than ever. But this time, it didn't crush me. This time, I had chosen it. The night before vows, a single message tried to break me. "You're a failure." The words lit up my phone screen like a flare in the dark, sharp enough to blind and burn at once. For a heartbeat, the room tilted. The steady lines of the Naval Chapel's guest quarters seemed to sway, the cross on the wall blurring. But the text was steady, immovable. My father's words, reduced to 4 syllables, carried the same weight as his silences had all my life. I set the phone face down on the desk. My reflection in the polished brass buttons of my dress whites stared back at me, waiting for me to decide whether those words could still wound. My hands moved methodically, cloth sliding in small circles, restoring each button to a quiet gleam. Ritual steadied me, shine the brass, straighten the ribbons, smooth the fabric, control the controllable. The chapel quarters were hushed, their walls thick enough to swallow the hum of the city outside. My uniform hung crisp on the wardrobe door, waiting for tomorrow's light. The smell of starch and brass polish filled the air, clean but heavy, like anticipation itself. A knock at the door broke the silence. 3 sharp raps. When I opened it, I found familiar faces, scarred, sunburned, grinning, in ways only men who had seen fire and walked back out could grin. Seals. Brothers forged not by blood, but by nights of gunfire and days of saltwater sweat. "Captain," one said, offering a salute that wasn't regulation, but was truer than any manual required. "Heard tomorrow's the big day. We weren't about to let you walk that aisle alone." There was laughter, low and rough, but steady with promise. One of them clapped my shoulder, the same shoulder that had carried more weight than my frame ever seemed built for. Another simply said, "You walked us through hell. We'll walk you tomorrow." Something in me loosened. For years I had measured myself against one man's silence. And here, standing in the narrow doorway, were men who had measured me by action, by nights survived and missions completed, by the sound of my orders carrying them through chaos. Their presence was more than camaraderie. It was a verdict delivered in my favor. We talked a little, not about the war or the scars, but about mundane things. Whose tuxedo shoes pinched, who had managed to smuggle a bottle of scotch into base quarters, who would keep James from pacing holes into the chapel carpet. Their words were easy, but their eyes told me they knew. They had come not only to witness, but to anchor. When they left, the room felt larger, but not emptier. Their footsteps echoed down the hall like a guard posted outside my door. I turned back to the desk. My phone, screen dark, waited. I picked it up, and with a swipe, there it was again. "Don't come to the wedding, you're a failure." No greeting, no name. Just the bluntness of a hammer meant to crack what was left of me. The words pressed into my chest, but this time the pressure didn't break bone. It crystallized something instead. I thought of every silence, every dismissal, every door closed in my face. His boots echoing in childhood hallways. His refusal to look at me when I showed him the academy letter. His absence at every milestone, even the battlefield where I earned a name, the enemy whispered. All of it condensed into this one final message. And instead of despair, I felt clarity. I slipped the phone into the breast pocket of my uniform jacket, the insult pressing against fabric that bore metals he had once sworn I would never touch. Let him call me failure. Tomorrow, every boot on that chapel floor would rise in salute to the title I had earned without him. The insult wouldn't be left behind. I would carry it with me, a weapon sharper than any blade, forged not from his disdain, but from my refusal to bow to it. Tomorrow, when I walked down that aisle, I would not be his daughter seeking approval. I would be Captain Claire Hallstead, carrying my father's last text, like a broken chain I chose never to wear again. Light flooded the chapel, and with it, every gaze locked on me. The heavy wooden doors swung wide with a creak that carried like thunder. For one suspended moment, I stood framed in the entryway, sunlight streaming from behind, spilling across polished pews filled with officers in uniform, family members in stiff suits, dignitaries whose medals glinted like constellations. The hush was absolute. I could hear only my own breath and the quiet pulse of my heart pressing against the starched collar of my dress whites. To my right and left, my SEAL comrades stood in formation. They had demanded that they escort me down the aisle. Not as bridesmaids, not as mere witnesses, but as brothers in arms who would not let me carry this weight alone. Their boots struck the floor in cadence with mine, a rhythm steadier than any organ music. Each step echoed through the vaulted ceiling, and I thought of another set of footsteps from long ago, my father's boots in a hallway, each one a judgment heavier than words. But these steps were mine and theirs, and they did not condemn, they proclaimed. Faces turned as I advanced. Some nodded, others blinked back tears, and I felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken acknowledgments, sacrifices remembered, debts paid in silence, respect finally breaking the surface. James stood at the altar, eyes never leaving me. In his gaze, I saw not awe but recognition, the way a man looks at the sum of someone's battles, and loves her not despite them, but because of them. Halfway down the aisle, a voice cut through the silence like a knife. Sorry to have kept Admiral Claire waiting. It was General Doyle, his baritone unmistakable, his words sharp enough to reverberate against the stone walls. He rose from his seat in the front row. The title Admiral Claire rolled across the chapel like a drumbeat. For a split second, confusion rippled. And then, as if pulled by an unseen tide, every officer in the room rose. Boots struck the floorboards. Hands snapped to brows. A synchronized salute thundered louder than any whisper could. The sound swelled, boots and breath and reverence colliding, and for the first time in my life, I felt my father's voice smothered, drowned beneath a wave of recognition I had earned in blood and sweat. His long shadow evaporated beneath the collective honor of my peers. I felt it in my chest, not pride alone, but vindication. Years of being told I did not belong, that my dreams were childish, that my medals weighed less because I was his daughter, all of it crushed under the weight of that rising salute. My spine straightened, shoulders squared. For once, I wasn't carrying silence on my back. I was lifted by it, made larger by the echo of boots that did not mock, but honored. The ceremony itself blurred around the edges, James's steady breathing beside me, the chaplain's measured words, the faint smell of lilies and candle wax. Every detail faded against the magnitude of that one moment when the room had risen, not because of Robert Hallstead, but in defiance of him. And then, from the far left pew, I caught his eyes. Robert did not move, did not stand, did not salute. His jaw was rigid, lips pressed into a line so thin it seemed carved in stone. But his eyes, those eyes that had once watched me with cold indifference, now burned with unmasked rage. Fury, not at my failures, but at my survival, at my triumph, at the proof that I had carved my place without him. The weight of his stare pressed against me, even as applause swelled and the chaplain's words carried on. For a heartbeat, the room's honor and his hatred existed together, colliding silently above the altar. And in that collision, I knew he was not finished. As I turned my head forward, lips poised to speak vows, I felt the certainty settle in my bones. My father would not let the silence be his last weapon. He was preparing to lash out. He didn't shout, but his scorn carried like gunfire in a chapel. The chaplain's voice rose in solemn cadence, words about vows and fidelity echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. The scent of lilies mixed with candle wax, the solemn hush broken only by measured syllables, and the faint creak of pews as people shifted to see more clearly. James's hand brushed mine, steadying, grounding me in the swirl of reverence and expectation. Then, like a splinter beneath the skin, a murmur threaded the silence. At first it was so soft I thought I imagined it, a ripple of sound smaller than a sigh. But it grew, syllables carving themselves sharp enough to pierce the chaplain's steady rhythm. "A clown in uniform," my father's voice said. It was not a shout. It didn't need to be. The words carried with a surgeon's precision, slicing into the marrow of the room. Every pew seemed to stiffen, heads turning fraction by fraction. The sound clung to the air, too heavy to dissipate. My breath caught, but I stood unmoving. My fingers tightened imperceptibly at my side, as though gripping a hilt that wasn't there. I knew this cadence. I had lived under it since childhood. His boots, his silence, his verdicts, now his venom. They lowered the bar for her. This time, louder, deliberate. It wasn't meant for me alone. It was for every pair of ears in the chapel, every medal on every chest, every whispered doubt he had seeded across years of rumor. Gasps threaded the silence. A cousin lowered her eyes to her lap. An uncle shook his head, lips pressing thin as if in agreement. The ripple moved outward. Shame, pity, skepticism. I could feel their weight pressing against my spine like lead bricks. But I refused to bend. I had stood through desert fire, had carried wounded men through saltwater-stained red, had faced the cruel indifference of silence every holiday when no letter came. If I could carry that, I could carry this. My chin lifted fractionally higher, eyes locked forward. I would not give him the satisfaction of flinching. James shifted beside me, his jaw tight, the faint tremor in his chest betraying the fury he swallowed. His hand itched to move, to defend, but I pressed my thumb against his ring finger, just enough pressure to say, "Not yet." The chaplain faltered, voice dipping for a heartbeat before he regained rhythm. But the ceremony's sacred cadence had been broken. What had been a seamless flow now carried a jagged scar. "He always knew she didn't belong," my father added, tone casual, as though stating a weather report. The words did not roar. They slithered, low and steady, wrapping themselves around the pews like smoke. They didn't need volume. The silence of the chapel was his amplifier. I felt the sting, sharp and searing, but something colder rose beneath it. A steel I had not inherited from him, but forged, despite him. My body remembered every dismissal, every ignored letter, every absence in the stands when others' parents clapped. And for the first time, I understood. His words were not iron. They were brittle glass. The murmur swelled, relatives exchanging glances. A senior officer coughing into his hand, one or two heads nodding as though shame were contagious. For a fraction of a second, I thought he had won. That the room had tilted toward him, toward the version of me he had always insisted upon. A fraud, a joke in borrowed cloth. But then something shifted. From the front row, General Doyle stirred. His shoulders squared with the kind of patience that was not patience at all, but the gathering of artillery before the strike. He turned slowly, the motion deliberate, each second stretching longer than breath. When his eyes landed on my father, they gleamed like tempered steel. The chapel's hush thickened, as though every lung forgot to breathe, every pulse leaned forward. My father smirked, mistaking Doyle's silence for complicity. He had mocked me all my life, in private. Now, in public, he believed the room would bend with him. But Doyle's gaze said otherwise. The silence before he spoke was heavier than the words themselves. It was the pause before a verdict, the moment the hammer hovers above the anvil. And I knew the clash had finally come. Some words weigh more than medals. A single sentence can crush lies. The chapel was frozen, the air brittle from the insult that had just been spoken. My father's mockery still vibrated against the stone walls, his smirk hanging like smoke no one dared wave away. Relatives kept their eyes low, but their silence carried the complicity of agreement. Officers shifted in stiff discomfort, some pretending to cough, others tightening their jaws as though unsure where to look. I stood motionless, spine erect, hands steady at my sides. Every instinct urged me to speak, to defend myself, but training held me fast. Silence could be its own weapon. The question was, would anyone wield it for me? Then came the sound of wood scraping against stone. General Doyle rose slowly from the front pew, every inch of his height commanding the room before his voice even formed. His medals caught the candlelight, glimmering like fire. He did not glance at me first, his eyes locked directly on Robert, unblinking, implacable, the gaze of a man accustomed to stripping illusions from soldiers who thought themselves stronger than they were. The murmurs died instantly. When he spoke, his tone was not raised, yet it struck harder than any shouted command. "Sorry to have kept Admiral Claire waiting. The words fell into the silence like iron into water, sending a ripple through every soul in the room. For the briefest heartbeat, confusion fluttered. Was it sarcasm? A rebuke? But the authority in his cadence admitted no ambiguity. Doyle's declaration was absolute. And then, like the turn of a tide, the entire assembly moved. Boots scraped, uniforms straightened, hands rose in unison. Officers, sailors, Marines, men and women spanning generations stood as one. The synchronized salute thundered louder than any accusation. It was not mere protocol. It was defiance. A verdict. The organ's pipes rattled faintly from the vibration of the boots striking in unison. The air itself seemed to tremble. For a moment, I felt small again, like the child who once reached for medals behind glass only to be slapped away. But then the sight crystallized. The weight of every salute now bent not toward my father's contempt, but toward me. Recognition that could not be silenced. Robert's smirk faltered. His lips pressed tighter, a vein rising at his temple. He had spent years weaving whispers, planting doubt, ensuring that when my name was spoken, it carried a question mark. And now, in less than a breath, Doyle had crushed the question, replacing it with a period carved in stone. I inhaled, slow, steady, letting the sound of honor fill my chest. James glanced sideways at me, his eyes gleaming, his lips curved in something between relief and triumph. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The chapel had spoken for me. The salutes held for long seconds, then lowered in perfect cadence, discipline amplifying the weight of respect. No one looked at Robert now. Their eyes belonged to Doyle, to me, to the truth made manifest. The chaplain, momentarily rattled, cleared his throat and tried to resume the ceremony, but the air had changed. The vows ahead would be remembered, but this was the moment engraved into history. And yet, the silence that followed carried its own warning. I glanced sideways toward my father. His face had reddened, his fists curled tight against the wood of the pew. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, as though struggling to contain the roar he could not unleash. For the first time, his voice had not owned the room. He had been silenced not by me, not by argument, but by an institution larger than both of us. The sight of him there, fists trembling, eyes burning, told me the battle was not over. He would not retreat quietly. A man who had spent his life believing he was the only standard-bearer could not accept being eclipsed by his daughter's truth. Still, the tide had shifted. For the first time, I felt his power stripped away, not chipped or debated, but obliterated in a single sentence. Doyle had not merely defended me, he had declared me. And in that declaration, my father's mockery crumbled into dust. But his clenched fists promised one thing. His war was not finished. Respect rose around me. He could only rise to leave. The chapel still thrummed with the echo of Doyle's words, the memory of 100 salutes hanging in the air like incense. The chaplain, voice steadying, returned to the rhythm of the vows. James's hand closed firmly over mine, warm, grounding, a reminder that this moment was not only about war, but about love. And yet, from the corner of my vision, I could feel the shadow of my father, sitting in that pew, fists coiled, face rigid with rage. The chaplain asked the gathered to stand once more. The creak of pews was a tide of reverence, but one sound cut against it. The deliberate scrape of shoes on stone, slower, heavier than the rest. Robert Hallstead stood, his spine ramrod straight, his jaw carved in disdain. He did not look at me. He did not look at Doyle. His eyes fixed on some distant point, as though by ignoring us all he could will himself above the weight of what had just happened. Without a word, he turned and began to walk down the center aisle. Gasps fluttered like startled birds. A cousin's hand rose to her mouth. An uncle muttered something that died in his throat. Every step he took away from me was a denial, a statement louder than the insults he had spat earlier. He was leaving, not because the ceremony had ended, but because he could not stay in a room that no longer bent to his will. The silence pressed down on every shoulder. Even the chaplain faltered again, pausing as the heavy doors creaked open. Light from the fading afternoon spilled into the nave, haloing Robert's figure in harsh silhouette. For a second he looked monumental, the patriarch striding into history. But then the doors closed behind him with a hollow thud, and what remained was absence. Through the colored glass at the chapel's side, I glimpsed him outside, rigid, isolated, framed by the last rays of dusk. His dress blues looked almost black in the waning light. He stood alone in the parking lot, hands clasped behind him like a general reviewing empty ranks. For the first time in my life, The sight of him evoked no fear, only distance. Inside, the air shifted, respect lingered, but unease threaded through the pews. Families exchanged glances, torn between loyalty and shame. Some stared at me with new recognition. Others avoided my gaze, afraid of what my triumph said about their silence through the years. The power my father once commanded fractured here, shards scattering among relatives who no longer knew which way to lean. James whispered, low enough for only me. He left the room. You stayed. I breathed in, steady, though my throat burned. Victory should have felt triumphant, but it tasted like iron. There was no joy in watching a father shrink into exile, only a grim confirmation. He had chosen pride over blood. The vows concluded, rings exchanged, promises spoken. Yet the gravity of the ceremony had been altered. Everyone knew the true event had already passed. Doyle's declaration, Robert's retreat, those would be the stories carried beyond these walls. In the parking lot, a cousin lingered with her phone. Discreetly, as though ashamed, she lifted it and snapped a photo. Robert standing alone outside the chapel, back turned to the stained glass, shoulders squared in a posture that no longer carried authority but emptiness. The image spread almost instantly, flicked from phone to phone, whispered across the gathering. He couldn't stay. He walked out. Did you see her face? She didn't flinch. By the time James and I recessed down the aisle, the photo had already begun its circuit through the family tree. Aunts looked at me with tentative respect, uncles with uneasy guilt. Younger cousins, once told I was a disappointment, now watched me with something closer to awe. But none of it erased the hollow ache in my chest. My father had not been defeated in debate. He had been defeated by his own inability to stand in a room where I was honored. That defeat stripped him of authority, yes, but it also stripped me of the last fragile thread of hope that he might one day see me for who I was. The doors opened again. The evening was cool, shadows stretching long across the asphalt. Robert was gone. The parking lot held only the fading echo of his departure. The photo remained, and with it, the undeniable truth. The man who once exiled me from his approval had exiled himself instead. Respect rose around me. He could only rise to leave. The chapel had not yet settled from the thunder of salutes. The chaplain's voice wavered once, then steadied, carrying forward the words of covenant and promise, as though nothing had fractured the sanctity. But everything had changed. The air still hummed with Doyle's declaration, with the weight of boots and palms that had chosen truth over rumor. I felt it in my chest, the strange mix of victory and ache. For years, I had imagined facing my father, imagined some duel of words where I might finally strike back. Yet the decisive blow hadn't been mine. It had come from a man whose authority eclipsed his, and from the collective respect of those who saw me not as an intruder, but as their equal. It should have felt sweet. Instead, it carried a bitter edge, because I could see him. Robert sat 2 pews back, fists still clenched, jaw rigid as stone. His eyes never left the floor now, as though the weight of the room bore down too heavily to meet it head-on. His silence, once weapon, now seemed brittle like glass that had cracked but not yet shattered. Then, in a motion as abrupt as a trigger pulled, he stood. The scrape of the pew echoed louder than any hymn. Heads turned, whispers broke again. He adjusted his uniform jacket with stiff precision, as though the act itself might restore the authority stripped from him. Without bowing his head, without a glance at me, he strode down the aisle. Every step resounded with the cadence of defeat. Not one hand reached to clasp his shoulder. Not one cousin or uncle rose to follow. He walked alone, a general without an army, past the rows of men and women who had chosen to stand for me instead. Through the stained glass, I glimpsed him once more. Outside, the sun was falling low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He paused there, rigid, framed against the twilight like a statue exiled to the margins. For a moment I thought he might turn back, reclaim the pew by force of will. But he didn't. He stood frozen, as though the doors behind him had become walls. Then a click, small, discreet, but audible enough to register. One of my cousins had raised her phone, capturing him in that posture, alone, outside, separated from the ceremony he had sought to dominate. A still image that told a larger truth: he could not stay in the same room where respect no longer belonged to him. The chaplain continued, voice steadying, guiding us toward vows and blessing. I tried to keep my eyes forward, but part of me remained tethered to that figure beyond the glass, the silhouette of the man who had defined my childhood. There had been a time I would have given anything for him to stay, to watch, to nod approval. Now I felt only the dull ache of a wound cauterized. James squeezed my hand. His touch anchored me, reminding me that the day was not his to ruin. Around us, relatives shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances heavy with shame, others with disbelief. They knew what the photo would mean when shared proof that Robert Hallstead had left his daughter's wedding, not in protest, not in triumph, but in surrender. The recessional began. Applause followed us down the aisle, though beneath it I still heard the echo of boots, not his boots this time, but my own, carrying me forward without him. By the time we reached the chapel doors, the parking lot was empty. Only the faint smell of his aftershave lingered in the air, dissipating quickly in the evening breeze. Later that night, the photo spread across family group chats. Robert outside the chapel, arms stiff, face rigid, back turned against the stained glass glow. The caption varied depending on who sent it, but one message repeated. He stood outside, he couldn't stay. Victory had come. But it did not taste like triumph. It tasted like ash, like the silence he left behind. We met not in a house or chapel, but among silent stones. The winter wind moved through Arlington with the weight of old hymns, carrying brittle leaves across rows of white marble. My boots crunched softly over the gravel path, the rhythm of them strangely calm compared to the storms that had marked every encounter with him before. This was no battlefield, no chapel full of witnesses, no tribunal of family or ranks. Only rows of markers, and the woman who had once stood between us now resting beneath one of them. The letter had arrived 2 weeks earlier, tucked into my mailbox in handwriting I recognized immediately. Robert Hallstead had never been careless with penmanship. His script bore the rigid lines of discipline. Inside, no grand confessions, no plea for absolution, just 3 sentences. I am sorry. I made it harder than it ever should have been. I can't undo it, but I want to stand where she stood. I hadn't known what to do with it. For nights I left it on my desk, the folded paper like a stone pressing on my chest. Finally, I agreed to meet him here. Not in my home, not in a bar or an office, but at Evelyn's grave, the only place where silence carried meaning instead of malice. He was already there when I arrived. The years had not softened him much. His posture remained straight, his shoulders squared as if invisible epaulets still weighed them down. Yet something had shifted. He didn't turn as I approached, didn't command the air like he once had. His hands rested awkwardly at his sides, and his cap hung from them, not perched in defiance. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was not the cutting kind of my childhood, not the contempt he had used to slice me down. It was tentative, fragile, as though the graves around us demanded we handle words with care. Finally, he said, almost to the stone rather than me, "You stand like your mother did." The words caught in my throat. Evelyn's voice came back to me then, soft as always. "You're stronger than you know, my storm." I blinked against the sting in my eyes. She believed in both of us. I managed, even when we didn't. His jaw moved as though working through 100 things left unsaid. I thought, if I was harder, you'd have no choice but to become stronger. He paused, shaking his head once. But all I did was drive you away. I wanted to demand more, to ask why he couldn't have chosen words of love instead of absence, why every silence had felt like exile. But looking at him, I saw the lines carved deep, the weight of battles fought not just in uniform, but in pride. He had come here, at least, and that mattered more than the speeches I had dreamed of forcing from him. He straightened slowly, then lifted his hand, not in command, not in condemnation. A salute hesitant, almost trembling, but unmistakable. The gesture of one officer to another. For a heartbeat I hesitated, unsure whether to return it. Forgiveness was still too far, the wound too deep. But recognition that I could give. I raised my hand, crisp and steady, the salute of the daughter he had once dismissed, now standing before him, not in defiance, but in truth. The moment held, then fell away. He lowered his hand first, eyes dropping. I turned back to the grave, resting my palm lightly on the cold marble. When I walked away, I didn't look back. I knew he might never change entirely, that silence could still swallow him. But he had chosen, at last, to step into the truth, however late. And that was enough to carry with me. The wind caught my uniform as I moved between the rows, whispering like Evelyn's voice in memory. "Stronger than you know, my storm. Respect isn't inherited, it's earned." And tonight the room rose not for me, but for what we built. The Pentagon auditorium glowed with polished brass and flags catching the overhead light. Rows of uniforms stretched in precise symmetry, the hum of anticipation steady but subdued. I stood at the podium in full dress whites, the weight of medals at my chest unfamiliar still, as though they belonged to someone else. In the front row, James's calm presence steadied me, his eyes saying more than words could have. And further down, in a simple suit, my father sat stiff, hands folded, the only man in the room without insignia on his chest. The award had been presented, already plaques and citations blur together after years of service. What mattered was the speech. They had asked me to speak on leadership, on what I had learned from decades of command and mistakes, victories and scars. I glanced at the pages I had written, then set them aside. My voice was steady as it carried through the hall. Leadership isn't about rank, it isn't about the weight of medals, or the stories we choose to polish for ceremonies like this. Leadership is about what you leave in others when you're no longer in the room. A murmur rippled in the crowd, the kind that meant they were listening. I've learned that command doesn't mean control. It means responsibility. It means standing between the people who follow you and the storms that try to break them. And it means knowing that the respect you demand will vanish the moment you stop earning it, but the respect you inspire that lasts far longer than any title. I paused, letting the silence breathe. My gaze caught Robert's, though only briefly. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. The first to rise were the cadets' young faces still sharp with eagerness, uniforms pressed within an inch of perfection. Their boots clicked against the floor as they stood in salute, the movement crisp, rehearsed, but the pride in it raw. Then more rows rose behind them. Sailors, officers, generals, admirals. The sound of hundreds rising in unison filled the auditorium like thunder, echoing the chapel months earlier. And then slowly, almost reluctantly, but without pause once he began, Robert stood. He did not wear a uniform, yet his spine held as rigid as the day he had first drilled me into silence. His hand lifted, the salute measured, precise. This time, there was no hesitation. For a moment, time folded. I remembered the sting of his words, the years of rejection, the silence that had carved me hollow. And yet here he was, standing not above me, but with me, not to command, not to control, but to acknowledge. After the applause quieted, I stepped down from the stage. The cadets approached first, one no older than I had been when the academy letter arrived years ago. His voice shook, though not from fear. "Ma'am," he said, "my father told me you saved his life. In Somalia, he said if I ever doubted myself, I should remember the officer who wouldn't leave him behind. He told me, follow her example." The words struck deeper than any medal pinned to my chest. This was legacy. Not the approval I had chased, not the silence I had endured, but the choice to live in a way that gave others courage. James's hand brushed mine as I returned to my seat. The hall was still alive with the afterglow of respect, a living current that felt larger than the sum of my failures or triumphs. I looked once more at Robert. His hand lowered slowly, and for the first time in my life, his eyes softened not pride, not regret, but something quieter, recognition. And I understood then that my story was no longer chained to his approval. My story lived in the cadets who saluted, the sailors who remembered, the voices who would carry forward what I had tried to embody, because the salute you inspire lasts longer than the one you receive. Though betrayal shadowed her steps for years, the tide finally turned in a hall where respect rose higher than scorn. Justice had not come swiftly, but when it arrived, it silenced the lies and left no doubt who had truly earned their place. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through a lifetime. No wall of deceit can stand forever against the tide of truth. Like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. Type 1 if you felt her fight as your own, or 2 if you believe the story still left questions unanswered.